I found the photograph at a medical antiques fair in Boston. It was a Saturday in November, one of those crisp New England days when the last autumn leaves cling stubbornly to their branches and the Charles River reflects a pale grey sky. The fair was held in a renovated warehouse in Cambridge, packed with dealers selling vintage medical instruments, pharmaceutical bottles, Asylum records, and institutional photography. I'd been browsing for about 2 hours when I noticed a dealer specializing in 19th century hospital and asylum materials. His table was covered with photographs, operating theaters, patient wards, medical staff portraits. Most were the typical institutional images you'd expect: formal, stiffly posed, meticulously documented. But one photograph stopped me cold. It was large, perhaps 16 by 20 inches, mounted on heavy cardboard that had aged to a deep cream color. The image showed approximately 40 women, all dressed in what appeared to be nursing uniforms, dark dresses with white aprons and distinctive white caps. They were arranged in 4 precise rows on what looked like stone steps in front of a brick building with large windows. The composition was striking. Every woman was clearly visible, their faces sharp and distinct despite the photograph's age. Some looked directly at the camera with professional seriousness. Others had slight smiles. A few seemed to be suppressing emotion, nervousness perhaps, or amusement at the formality of the occasion. It was exactly the kind of staff portrait you'd expect from a late Victorian medical institution. Professional women captured in a moment of institutional pride. Except something about it bothered me. I couldn't identify what at first, but one face in particular kept drawing my attention. A woman in the 3rd row, slightly right of center, while the others had the composed expressions of professionals posing for an official photograph. This woman's face showed something different. Her eyes were wider, more intense. Her smile seemed forced, as if she were trying very hard to appear calm. The dealer noticed my interest. "That's from the Northfield State Lunatic Asylum in Massachusetts," he said. "Nursing staff, 1885. One of the best preserved institutional photographs I've seen from that era." "Do you know anything about it?" I asked. "Not much beyond what's written on the back. It came from an estate sale, a descendant of one of the asylum superintendents. Apparently it hung in the administration building for decades." He flipped the photograph over to show me the notation on the mounting board. "Northfield State Lunatic Asylum Nursing Staff. Women's Division. October 15th, 1885. Photographer, J.P. Morrison, Boston." And below that, in different handwriting, in faded pencil, and added clearly much later, "Patient number 427, successfully concealed for 6 months. See Dr. Aldrich's confidential report, April 1886. My pulse quickened. "How much?" "$200. I paid without hesitation. That evening in my hotel room, I spread the photograph across the desk and examined it under a lamp with a magnifying glass. 40 women, all in uniform. Which one was patient number 427? And how had a patient managed to conceal herself among the nursing staff for 6 months? I began with the woman who'd caught my attention initially, 3rd row, slightly right of center. Her expression was definitely different from the others. But was that enough to identify her as a patient rather than staff? I looked at posture, hand positions, the way each woman held herself. Most of the nurses stood or sat with the confident bearing of professionals, comfortable in their roles. But the woman I'd noticed seemed to be holding herself more rigidly, as if concentrating very hard on maintaining her position. I decided to start researching the Northfield State Lunatic Asylum the next morning. The Massachusetts State Archives had extensive records from Northfield, which had operated from 1874 to 1962. I requested all materials related to October 1885 and April 1886, specifically looking for anything involving Dr. Aldrich or patient number 427. After 2 days of searching through admission logs, staff employment records, and correspondence, I found what I was looking for in a box labeled Administrative Incidents, Confidential, 1886. Inside was a typewritten report marked Confidential, Board of Trustees only. Confidential report to the Board of Trustees. Northfield State Lunatic Asylum, April 20th, 1886. Submitted by Dr. Charles Aldrich, Assistant Superintendent Gentleman. It is my duty to report an incident of extraordinary nature that has come to light regarding the operations of our Women's Division. The matter involves a patient who successfully concealed her identity and functioned as a member of our nursing staff for a period of approximately 6 months. The patient in question, whom I will refer to as patient number 427 to protect her identity per board policy, was admitted to Northfield in March 1885. She was committed by her husband, Mr. Redacted, a lawyer of some prominence in Boston, with supporting certification from Dr. Redacted. The diagnosis at admission was moral insanity with delusional tendencies. Specifically, patient number 427 was described as exhibiting inappropriate independence of thought, rejection of wifely duties, and persistent belief that her husband was treating her unjustly. Upon initial examination, I noted that patient number 427 was unusually articulate and intelligent. However, given the diagnosis and the supporting documentation from her husband and physician, she was assigned to our women's ward for treatment. Patient number 427's behavior in the ward was exemplary by all accounts. She was cooperative, helpful to other patients, and displayed none of the agitation or defiance described in her admission papers. After 3 months, in June 1885, she was granted privileges to assist with basic ward duties, distributing meals, helping with cleaning, assisting less functional patients. This was standard practice for well-behaved patients and was considered therapeutic, providing structure and useful occupation. However, what we did not realize was that patient number 427 was using these privileges to study our nursing staff. She observed their routines, their duties, their manner of dress and speech. She made note of which nurses worked which shifts and which areas of the asylum they were least likely to be seen. In early October 1885, when a new group of probationary nurses began their training, patient number 427 executed a remarkable deception. She obtained a nursing uniform. We still do not know exactly how, though we suspect she may have sewn one herself, using materials from the sewing room. She styled her hair in the manner of our nursing staff, and she simply began functioning as a nurse. The deception was aided by several factors. The new probationary nurses had just arrived and did not know all the existing staff members. Patient number 427's presence among them was not questioned. Our nursing staff at that time numbered over 40 women. In the busy ward environment, it was not unusual for staff members to be unfamiliar with every colleague. Patient number 427 was intelligent enough to understand nursing procedures from observation. She performed her assumed duties competently. The staff photograph taken on October 15th, 1885, included patient number 427 among the nursing staff. No one questioned her presence. She appears in the third row, seventh from the left. For 6 months, patient number 427 worked alongside our genuine nursing staff. She assisted with patient care, administered treatments under supervision, kept records, and participated in all the normal activities of an asylum nurse. By multiple accounts, she performed these duties well. The deception was discovered only by chance. In April 1886, patient number 427's husband came to visit her, his first visit since her admission a year earlier. When he asked to see his wife, we initially could not locate her in the patient wards. After some confusion, it was determined that she had been functioning as a nurse. When confronted, patient number 427 did not deny the deception. She stated calmly that she had never been insane, that her commitment was unjust, and that she had proved her sanity by successfully performing the duties of a nurse for 6 months. She argued that if she could function competently as staff, she obviously did not belong as a patient. This argument, while logically compelling, created a significant institutional problem. How should we respond to a patient who successfully impersonated staff? I consulted with Superintendent Dr. Patterson and with several members of the medical staff. We faced several options. Number 1, immediately return patient number 427 to patient status, possibly with restrictions or punishment for her deception. Number 2, acknowledge that her successful impersonation demonstrated sanity and release her. Number 3, conduct a thorough reevaluation of her mental state to determine if her original diagnosis was accurate. After considerable deliberation, we chose the third option. Patient number 427 was examined by 3 independent physicians over a period of 2 weeks. All 3 concluded that she showed no signs of mental illness or delusion. Her thinking was clear, her emotional responses appropriate, her behavior entirely rational. The physicians noted that her commitment papers described symptoms that appeared to be normal expressions of female independence rather than evidence of mental disorder. One examining physician wrote, "This woman's only insanity appears to have been that she disagreed with her husband and expressed opinions he found inconvenient." Based on these evaluations, patient number 427 was released from Northfield on April 15, 1886. However, this case raises profound questions about our admission and diagnostic procedures. How was a sane woman committed to our institution in the first place? How did she remain undetected as a patient-turned-nurse for 6 months? What does her successful performance of nursing duties tell us about our assessment of mental fitness? Are there other patients who have been wrongly committed? I recommend that the board consider the following reforms. Require multiple independent physicians to certify commitment, not just the referring physician and our admitting physician. Establish regular review procedures for all patients, with evaluations by physicians not involved in the original diagnosis. Create mechanisms for patients to appeal their commitments or request re-evaluation. Review all current patients who were committed by family members under diagnoses of moral insanity to ensure they are genuinely ill and not merely inconvenient to their families. The case of patient number 427 is both embarrassing and illuminating. Embarrassing because it reveals how easily our systems can be deceived. Illuminating because it demonstrates that some of our diagnostic categories may be capturing behavior that is not actually pathological. I await the board's guidance on how to proceed. Respectfully submitted, Charles Aldrich, MD Assistant Superintendent. I sat back in my chair, processing what I'd just read. A woman had been wrongly committed by her husband, had realized that her only way to prove her sanity was to demonstrate her capability, and had successfully passed as a nurse for 6 months before being discovered. It was simultaneously disturbing and inspiring. Disturbing because it confirmed what I already knew about wrongful commitments of women in the 19th century. Inspiring because of the sheer audacity and intelligence of patient number 427's response to her situation. I needed to know more. Who was patient number 427? What happened to her after her release? And what, if anything, changed at Northfield as a result of her case? I returned to the archives and began searching through additional records. In the patient admission logs for March 1885, I found her. Patient number 427. Name, Margaret Ellen Hartley. Age, 31. Admitted, March 23rd, 1885. Diagnosis, moral insanity with delusional tendencies. Committed by husband, Edward Hartley, Esquernan, with certification by Dr. T. Morrison. Released, April 15th, 1886. I searched for more information about Margaret Hartley and found a fascinating paper trail. Before her commitment, she had been active in the women's suffrage movement in Boston. She'd attended Wellesley College, unusual for a woman of her era, and had written articles for suffrage publications under a pseudonym. Her husband, Edward Hartley, was indeed a prominent lawyer, and from what I could piece together from newspaper society pages and legal directories, he was also a vocal opponent of women's suffrage. Margaret's commitment had occurred shortly after she'd been invited to speak at a women's rights convention in New York. According to a letter I found in another archive, Edward had forbidden her to attend. She had defied him and made plans to go anyway. Within a week, she was committed to Northfield. After her release in April 1886, Margaret's story took a remarkable turn. I found newspaper articles documenting what happened next. From the Boston Daily Advertiser, May 2nd, 1886. The extraordinary case of Mrs. Margaret Hartley. Boston society has been fascinated by the case of Mrs. Margaret Hartley, recently released from the Northfield Lunatic Asylum after proving her sanity in a most unusual manner. Mrs. Hartley, wife of attorney Edward Hartley, was committed to Northfield in March 1885 at her husband's request. However, Mrs. Hartley maintains that she was never insane, that her commitment was an attempt by her husband to silence her advocacy for women's rights. While at Northfield, Mrs. Hartley did not simply wait for release. Instead, she obtained a nursing uniform and successfully impersonated a member of the asylum's nursing staff for 6 months, performing her duties so competently that no one suspected her true identity. Her deception was discovered only when Mr. Hartley came to visit and could not locate his wife among the patients. An investigation revealed that Mrs. Hartley had been working as a nurse. 3 independent physicians subsequently examined Mrs. Hartley and concluded unanimously that she suffers from no mental illness. She was released on April 15th. Mrs. Hartley has now filed for divorce from Mr. Hartley, citing his wrongful commitment of her as grounds. She has also filed a civil suit against both Mr. Hartley and Dr. Morrison, the physician who certified her commitment, for false imprisonment and conspiracy. The case has sparked intense public discussion about the ease with which women can be committed to asylums by husbands who find them inconvenient. Several women's rights organizations have embraced Mrs. Hartley as a symbol of the legal vulnerability of married women. Mr. Hartley has declined to comment, referring all inquiries to his attorney. I found more articles over the following months, documenting Margaret's legal battles and her emergence as a prominent figure in the women's rights movement. Her case became a rallying cry for reformers who argued that married women needed legal protections against wrongful commitment. The divorce was granted in 1887, unusual for the time, but the circumstances of Margaret's commitment made it impossible for any judge to deny her petition. The civil suit settled out of court, with Edward Hartley paying substantial damages. Margaret used the settlement money to establish the Women's Legal Defense Fund, which provided legal assistance to women fighting wrongful commitments and other injustices. She spent the rest of her life as an activist, speaker, and writer on women's rights and mental health reform. I found her obituary from 1923, Margaret Ellen Hartley, 69, pioneer of women's rights. Margaret Ellen Hartley, prominent advocate for women's rights and mental health reform, died yesterday at her home in Boston. She was 69 years old. Mrs. Hartley first gained public attention in 1886, when she exposed the ease with which women could be wrongly committed to insane asylums. After being committed by her husband to silence her suffrage advocacy, Mrs. Hartley proved her sanity by successfully impersonating an asylum nurse for 6 months. Her subsequent legal battles and advocacy work led to significant reforms in commitment procedures in Massachusetts and other states. She was instrumental in establishing requirements for independent medical evaluations and creating appeal mechanisms for asylum patients. Mrs. Hartley spoke frequently about her experiences, always emphasizing that her case was not unique, that many women were confined to asylums not because they were insane, but because they were inconvenient to fathers, husbands, or brothers who held legal authority over them. "I was fortunate," she often said. "I had education, intelligence, and eventually the resources to fight back. But for every woman like me who escaped, there were dozens who didn't, who spent their lives locked away, their voices silenced, their abilities wasted." Mrs. Hartley never remarried. She devoted her life to advocacy work, helping countless women secure their legal rights and freedom from unjust confinement. She is survived by numerous friends and colleagues in the women's rights movement. Memorial services will be held at the First Church in Boston. I spent the next several weeks researching the broader impact of Margaret's case. I found that Dr. Aldrich's recommended reforms had largely been implemented at Northfield and had influenced policy at other Massachusetts asylums. Requirements for multiple independent certifications for commitment became standard. Review procedures were established. Appeal mechanisms were created. But the changes took time, and they were incomplete. Wrongful commitments of women continued throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, though perhaps with less frequency than before reformers like Margaret raised public awareness. I also found more about what happened to the nursing staff at Northfield after Margaret's deception was discovered. The staff photograph from October 1885, the one I'd purchased, became something of an infamous document within asylum administration circles. It was used in training materials to illustrate the importance of knowing one's colleagues and maintaining proper identification procedures. Several of the nurses who'd worked alongside Margaret, without realizing she was a patient, later wrote about the experience. Their accounts were remarkably respectful toward her. From a memoir by Sarah Blackwell, who'd been a probationary nurse at Northfield in 1885. When we learned that Nurse Margaret had actually been a patient, I was astonished. She had been kind to patients, competent in her duties, and pleasant to work alongside. She had seemed exactly like any other nurse, perhaps more capable than some. The revelation forced me to question everything I thought I knew about insanity. If a supposedly insane woman could function perfectly well as a nurse, what did that say about our understanding of mental illness? What did it say about the women we were locking away? I began to pay more attention to the women in our wards, listening to their stories rather than simply accepting their diagnoses. I was disturbed by how many had been committed, not because they displayed symptoms of mental illness, but because they'd violated social expectations. They'd been too independent, too outspoken, too educated, too interested in matters supposedly beyond women's proper sphere. Margaret Hartley's courage in exposing her wrongful commitment and her cleverness in proving her competence changed how I understood my work as a nurse. It made me an advocate for my patients rather than simply a guardian of social order. I decided to write a comprehensive account of Margaret's story, using it as a lens to examine the broader issue of wrongful commitment of women in the 19th century. The photograph would be central to the narrative, visual evidence of Margaret's remarkable 6-month deception. The book was titled The Patient Nurse, Margaret Hartley, and the Fight Against Wrongful Commitment in Victorian America. Writing it took nearly 3 years. I examined asylum records, court documents, suffrage movement archives, newspaper accounts, and personal papers. I interviewed descendants of people who'd known Margaret and of other asylum staff and patients from that era. What emerged was a portrait of a woman of extraordinary intelligence and courage, who turned her wrongful imprisonment into an opportunity to expose systemic injustice, and a portrait of a system that routinely confined sane women for the crime of being inconvenient to men with power over them. The photograph became iconic. I included it on the book's cover, with Margaret's position indicated by a subtle mark. Looking at it, knowing the truth, transformed it from an ordinary institutional photograph into something remarkable. Visual evidence of resistance, of intelligence used to survive injustice, of a woman who refused to accept her wrongful confinement. The book was published by a university press and received positive reviews in both academic journals and popular publications. It sparked renewed interest in the history of wrongful commitment and in Margaret Hartley's life and work. I received many letters in response. Some were from descendants of women who'd been wrongfully committed, grateful that these stories were being told. Others were from mental health professionals and advocates who saw parallels to contemporary issues around involuntary commitment and patient rights. One letter particularly moved me. It was from Margaret Hartley's great-great-niece. Dear Dr. Morrison, thank you for writing this book and bringing my great-great-aunt Margaret's story to wider attention. Growing up, I heard family stories about her, that she'd been a suffragist, that she'd done something remarkable involving an asylum, that she'd been a pioneering advocate. But I never knew the full story until reading your book. The photograph on the cover is extraordinary. Knowing that Margaret is standing there among the nursing staff, maintaining her deception, proving her competence and sanity through sheer determination, it's both heartbreaking and inspiring. Heartbreaking, because she shouldn't have had to prove anything. She should never have been committed in the first place. The fact that a sane woman had to impersonate a nurse for 6 months just to convince anyone she wasn't insane reveals how little value was placed on women's own testimony about their mental state. But inspiring, because she didn't give up. She didn't accept the identity that had been forced on her. She found a way to demonstrate the truth through action rather than words. I've always been proud to be related to Margaret, but your research has given me a much fuller understanding of what she accomplished. She wasn't just a victim who escaped. She was a strategic thinker who turned her victimization into advocacy that helped countless other women. The photograph captures that moment of transition, when she was still officially a patient, but was already proving she never should have been. It's a document of resistance, hiding in plain sight. Thank you for ensuring her courage and intelligence are remembered. Sincerely, Elizabeth Hartley Morrison. The photograph now hangs in my study, a constant reminder of how systems of power can abuse vulnerable people, and how individuals can resist even when they seem to have no power at all. I look at those 40 women often, 39 genuine nurses, doing difficult work, caring for mentally ill patients in an era when treatment options were limited and understanding of mental illness was primitive, and one patient concealed among them, proving her sanity through the simple act of functioning competently. The photograph was taken on October 15th, 1885. By that time, Margaret had been successfully impersonating a nurse for about 2 weeks. She would continue for another 6 months before being discovered. That's 180 days of maintaining her deception, of performing nursing duties competently enough that no one questioned her identity, of proving every single day that she didn't belong in an asylum. The photograph looks ordinary at first glance, just another institutional staff portrait, the kind taken at hospitals and asylums throughout the late Victorian era. Professional women, formally posed, documented for administrative purposes, but knowing the truth transforms it. It becomes evidence of wrongful imprisonment, proof of intelligence and courage, documentation of a deception that exposed a terrible truth about how easily women could be locked away. Margaret stands in the 3rd row, 7th from the left. Her face shows the strain of maintaining her deception, the forced calm, the rigid posture, the intensity in her eyes. She's holding herself together through sheer force of will, knowing that if she's discovered, she'll be returned to the patient ward, possibly with restrictions or punishment, certainly with her attempt to prove her sanity dismissed as further evidence of her disorder. But she wasn't discovered. Not that day. Not for months afterward. And when she was finally discovered, she'd been so successful in her role that 3 independent physicians agreed she'd never been insane. That's what the photograph documents. Not just a moment of deception, but a moment of resistance. A moment when a woman refused to accept society's judgment that she was insane simply because she'd been inconvenient to her husband. The other women in the photograph, the genuine nurses, were doing important work. Many of them, like Sarah Blackwell, were dedicated professionals who cared about their patients. But they were also part of a system that routinely confined sane women, and most of them didn't question that system until Margaret's case forced them to. The photograph captures all of these realities simultaneously. It's a document of institutional life, of women's professional work, of wrongful confinement, and of individual resistance. It looks ordinary, but it contains an extraordinary story. I've given many talks about Margaret's case at conferences, universities, and community organizations. People always ask the same questions. How did she do it? What happened to the asylum afterward? Are similar injustices happening today? The answers are complex. Margaret succeeded through a combination of intelligence, observation, courage, and luck. The asylum eventually reformed its procedures, though similar abuses continued elsewhere. And yes, concerns about wrongful commitment and about systems that silence inconvenient people remain relevant. But what resonates most with audiences is simply Margaret's audacity, the sheer boldness of deciding that if the system wouldn't listen to her words, she'd prove herself through actions. If they wouldn't believe she was sane, she'd demonstrate it by doing work that required sanity. The photograph has been exhibited at several museums as part of exhibitions on women's history and mental health history. It always draws attention. Visitors study the faces, trying to identify which woman is Margaret. Some can pick her out. They notice the tension in her expression, the careful control in her posture. Others are surprised when they learn which one she is. That's part of the photograph's power. Margaret is both obvious and hidden. If you know what to look for, you can see the signs of her deception. But if you don't know, she's invisible, just another nurse among many. The photograph looked ordinary. A staff portrait from a Victorian asylum. 40 women in nursing uniforms, professionally posed, meticulously documented. But it documented something extraordinary. A sane woman concealed among the staff of the asylum that held her captive, proving through her successful deception that she'd never belonged there in the first place. For 6 months, from October 1885 to April 1886, Margaret Hartley lived a double life. By day, she functioned as a nurse, caring for patients, administering treatments, keeping records. By night, she presumably returned to the staff quarters, maintaining her deception even in off hours. The photograph captures her in the middle of this extraordinary performance. She's there, clearly visible, documented for posterity. But no one looking at the photograph in 1885 knew the truth. They saw a nurse. They saw a staff member. They didn't see a patient proving her sanity through the most audacious means imaginable. It took 6 months for the truth to be discovered, and then only by accident. If Edward Hartley hadn't visited when he did, if he hadn't asked to see his wife, Margaret might have continued her deception indefinitely. She might have eventually simply walked away from the asylum, having proved to herself, if no one else, that she was sane. But the discovery, while traumatic in the moment, ultimately worked in her favor. The evaluation by independent physicians vindicated her. The publicity from her case helped other women. The reforms she advocated saved lives. The photograph remains, beautiful in its composition, terrible in what it represents, powerful in its documentation of resistance. 40 women, one remarkable story, captured forever in an image that looked ordinary, but was anything but. May Margaret Hartley be remembered for her courage, her intelligence, and her refusal to accept an identity that wasn't hers. May the nurses who worked alongside her unknowingly be remembered for their dedication to difficult work. And may the asylum administrators who allowed a sane woman to be confined be remembered as a cautionary tale about the abuse of medical authority. The photograph tells all of these stories simultaneously. An ordinary staff portrait that documented an extraordinary act of resistance. The patient in disguise, hiding in plain sight, proving her sanity one shift at a time. Her name was Margaret Ellen Hartley. She was 31 years old when this photograph was taken. She was completely sane. And she spent 6 months of her life impersonating a nurse to prove it. That's the story the photograph tells. Once you know how to read it, that's the truth it preserves across nearly 140 years. An ordinary asylum staff portrait that was never ordinary at all.